Welcome to the Global News Podcast here on YouTube. I'm Valerie Sanderson and I'm joined by our political correspondent, Rob Watson. This is a very big week, isn't it, for British politics? Keir Starmer making likely his last appearance in Parliament as Prime Minister, and his likely successor, Andy Burnham, is being grilled by members of his Labour Party about what he'll do once in office, and that's expected within days. So what will Andy Burnham's priorities be on the world stage?
I think when it comes to foreign policy, I think continuity much more than radical change. I mean, I know that doesn't sound very sexy, but I think it is important to be straightforward about this and to say that British foreign policy is very much driven by our history, by our geography, by the country's interests, by events, of course, things like Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there are these kind of solid drivers. So I think expect to see the same kind of worldview from Andy Burnham as we've had from Keir Starmer. And important to remember that as far as we know, Andy Burnham is going to be keeping absolutely key and senior members of Britain's foreign policy team, the team that existed under Keir Starmer. So those priorities are free trade, trying to somehow maintain good relations with the United States, given the current incumbent of the White House, trying to continue that sort of process of repairing, if you like, the damage in EU-UK relations since Brexit, and essentially being a champion, as Keir Starmer has been, for Britain's belief in the sort of international rule of law, multinational organisations like NATO and the United Nations.
Well, you mentioned President Trump, and he views Andy Burnham, I think, as extremely liberal, is what he said. So it's going to be quite a tricky one for Andy Burnham, isn't it?
It is, but I mean, I guess you could say Keir Starmer. You couldn't get much more liberal than Keir Starmer in the view of many in the White House. I mean, he was formerly a human rights lawyer. I mean, that's pretty liberal, Valerie, pretty liberal. So, you know, it'll be an odd combination. I think people thought that Keir Starmer and Donald Trump would be an odd combination. People thought that Theresa May and Donald Trump would be an odd combination. That really was. That did look very, very strained. But, you know, Britain's interests are what will be uppermost in Andy Burnham's mind. And, you know, it'll be the same for him as it was for Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, that, you know, Britain must have a close relationship with the United States. It is the UK's most important trade partner, most important security partner. I mean, will there be a few sparks? Will, you know, may Andy Burnham speak in a way that perhaps Keir Starmer hasn't? He's been very restrained when talking about Donald Trump. Who knows? But I don't think the fundamentals are going to change very much.
And what about the relationship with the EU? They're concerned, aren't they, about Britain fulfilling its promises about increasing defence spending?
Yes, they are concerned, not just the EU, but Britain's NATO partners, including, of course, the United States. And I think it's worth pointing out, by the way, Valerie, that plenty of people in Britain's defence establishment, whether that's in the armed forces or in defence manufacturing, are also worried as to exactly how Britain is going to keep these promises to increase very significantly defence spending in the decade ahead. And so far, Andy Burnham has endorsed that idea of increased defence spending. But exactly as with the Keir Starmer government, exactly how Britain is going to get there in the next 10 years, whether it will raise extra taxes, whether it will cut other bits of public spending, a lot of those difficult decisions still lie ahead.
And what about Andy Burnham's attitude to Britain's relationship with the EU itself?
Well, again, I hate to be the continuity bore, Valerie, but you know, like Keir Starmer, he was very much Remainer. He campaigned for Remain in 2016. Very much like Sir Keir Starmer, he's on the record of saying that he thinks Brexit was a big mistake for Britain economically and diplomatically. But he has also said recently that while it has done damage to the British economy, he doesn't think that it's helpful to reopen that whole sort of debate about the referendum and whether Britain should rejoin. I mean, one should point out that about a year ago, he did say that he hoped that in his lifetime Britain would rejoin the European Union. But since then, as politicians often do, Valerie, he's somewhat changed his tune because he's rather worried about upsetting Leave voters who used to vote Labour. But I mean, in broader terms, to get to the sort of nub of your question briefly, I think he will continue the work of Keir Starmer, and that is to get Britain close to the European Union in terms of trade and security, but in a limited way. And that limit are those red lines that Britain has of not rejoining the two main institutions, what really makes the EU what it is, namely the single market, hugely important, or its customs union.
And what about Andy Burnham's attitude to Ukraine? Because Ukraine is apparently worried about political instability here in the UK and what it means for support for their war against Russia.
I don't think the Ukrainians need to be too worried about that, because when it comes to foreign policy challenges, it is just about the Ukraine the only thing that carries cross-party support in the UK, and certainly carries support with British voters. So I think of all the areas of foreign policy, that's probably the one where you would see absolutely the least change, because Andy Burnham has pledged his support for Ukraine, for its continued, as they would see it, resistance to the Russian invasion, and that is shared pretty much entirely across the political spectrum. Now, the more complicated issue is how will he manage President Trump, and trying to keep President Trump and the United States administration engaged with helping with Ukraine's defense. And of course, how will Britain continue to fund supplying military aid and other material support for Ukraine? But actually, the broad thrust, is Andy Burnham as keen as Keir Starmer was that Ukraine should survive, and is that support pretty rock solid behind him across the country? Absolutely it is.
Sir Keir Starmer, he's on a diplomatic blitz, isn't he, in Paris at the moment. How do you think he's fared as an international statesman? Do you think he's done that better than the way he's regarded at home?
Well, I mean, that's certainly what his supporters would say, that if you were to sort of tot up the score on Keir Starmer, they would probably concede that as a domestic politician, he has squandered the gigantic majority that he won in July 2024, that he'd been a domestic failure, deeply unpopular, but that he had foreign policy successes in terms of managing the UK's relationship with the United States and with Donald Trump when it comes to issues like tariffs. Keir Starmer himself often praises himself for having kept Britain out of the war between the United States, Iran and Israel, and he would say he'd been quietly working to restore British relations with the European Union and to sort of restore, as he would see it, Britain's standing on the international stage as a supporter of international norms and institutions like the UN. So I guess not entirely unusually in recent British history, Valerie, he has become more popular with fellow heads of government and heads of state than he has been with his own voters. But, that's hardly unusual in British politics, or indeed the politics of other democracies.
And talking about the world stage, how important is a change of British Prime Minister?
It is a very good question. And, I was talking not that long ago with an incredibly sort of senior figure formally from British diplomacy, someone who'd had a key role in many of Britain's big foreign policy challenges. And this person said to me, I wonder how much it actually matters when we have a change in Prime Minister, given that Britain is no longer a member of the European Union. In other words, this ex-diplomat was making the case that Britain had been weakened on the world stage, that it had somehow removed one of its key tools from its foreign policy basket. And I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that the outside world has been looking in on Britain's sort of domestic political tribulations these last 10 years or so. And I think it's just a sort of a statement of fact, isn't it, that countries which don't look massively united and prosperous at home clearly carry less clout on the international stage. I mean, I think you have to be careful about overstating that. Britain still has, a very large economy, one of the top 10 in the world. It still has some pretty efficient armed forces. It has very impressive intelligence agencies. And of course, it has a seat at the top table in many organizations, particularly one thinks of its seat on the UN Security Council. But I mean, does Andy Burnham inherit, the leadership of a country absolutely kind of widely regarded around the world in perhaps the same way it was 10, 15 years ago? Possibly not.
And do you think actually he will be very much preoccupied with domestic matters, particularly the economy, than striding across the world stage as an international statesman?
I guess the answer to that, Valerie, is if he has any say in it, he will. But I mean, I guess, as Keir Starmer pointed out and previous prime ministers, you don't really get a choice. I mean, if you're a country with a high profile like the UK, and if you're very much exposed to the world in terms of trade and security, if stuff happens, you just have to deal with that, because that does affect the living conditions of your voters and your citizens. But absolutely, and no doubt that Andy Burnham will try to prioritise turning around, I guess, what you would call this rather gloomy mood which has descended on Britain these last 10 years. So you have one of those interesting lines in one of Andy Burnham's speeches recently where he talks about, restoring hope in every hard heart and growth in every postcode, this sort of idea that we all need to cheer up and we need to have growth everywhere. So there's no doubt that'll be his absolute priority. Whether he's allowed to do that, I mean, who knows? And just sort of one final thought on that, because we've been talking a lot about foreign policy. In the end, all politics is local, in the sense that what really drives British Prime Ministers, and I'm sure Andy Burnham will be no different, is number one, how on earth do you keep your own MPs and activists happy from one Saturday to the next? And the other thing that Prime Ministers always have an eye on is the next election and winning it. So yes, the world won't go away, but do politicians tend to focus on, who casts votes for them and who supports them in Parliament? You betcha.
Thanks, Rob. That was Rob Watson, our political correspondent. If you'd like to find out more about this story, listen to the Global News podcast. Just click on the link below. But that's it from this edition of the Global News podcast here on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And bye for now.